The air in Ashwater Bend held its breath. It was late afternoon, the sun a heavy hand pressing down on the high plains, bleaching the sky to a pale, tired blue. What little wind stirred carried the scent of crushed sage and dust, a dry perfume that was the only constant in this land. It blew grit against Rowan Hale's neck, but he didn't flinch. At 35, stillness had become his armor. He rode his old gray gelding, a horse whose best years were long past, but whose gait was steady, reliable. Rowan preferred it that way. He had little use for things that were flashy and unproven. He was a rancher, a man defined by the fences he mended and the cattle he kept, and his face, weathered under the brim of a stained hat, held the quiet severity of a man who spoke only when necessary. He was headed to Mesquite Hollow, a place run by a man named Wyeth Crowder, on the rumor of a horse for sale. Rowan needed a new mount for the high pastures, and word was Crowder had one. Cheap. As he topped the last rise overlooking the hollow, Rowan reined in the gray. Something was wrong. The place was silent. Not quiet, but silent. A working ranch, even a small one, had a rhythm, the clang of a hammer, the lowing of cattle, the shout of a hired hand, the distant sound of a woman calling children in for supper. Mesquite Hollow had only the wind whistling through the gaps in its fence. Rowan nudged the gelding forward, his eyes scanning, missing nothing. The top rail of the main corral was split, sagging like a broken arm. The water trough nearby was bone dry. Its bottom cracked into a spider web of baked mud. There was no smoke from the chimney of the main house, no chickens scratching in the yard, no laundry hanging on a line. The whole place looked abandoned, but not empty. It felt held, possessed by a mean stillness. He dismounted by the barn, the gray stamping nervously, its ears swiveling. "Easy, boy," Rowan murmured, his voice a low rumble. He tied the reins to a hitching post that wobbled under the small pressure. He stood for a moment, letting the silence settle on him. He was a man who had seen the elephant, fought in a war he no longer spoke about, and the skin on the back of his neck prickled. This was the same feeling he'd had before an ambush, the sense of a trap waiting to be sprung. Rowan moved toward the wide, dark mouth of the barn. The heavy doors were slightly ajar, hanging crooked on their leather hinges. He pushed one open wider. It scraped over the hard-packed dirt floor, the sound unnaturally loud. The sudden shift from blinding sun to deep shadow made him pause. His eyes adjusted slowly. The air inside was thick, layered with smells. There was the familiar, comforting scent of dry hay and old leather. But beneath it, something else, the sharp, rusty tang of old iron. And fainter still, something metallic and spoiled. A coppery smell that his brain knew instantly, viscerally, from battlefields and butchering. It was the smell of old blood. His hand, which had been resting loosely by his side, moved almost invisibly to settle on the grip of the revolver holstered on his hip. He didn't draw it, but the contact was a comfort. His gaze swept the stalls. They were empty. No horses, no tools, just dust motes dancing in the few shafts of light that pierced the gloom. Then he saw it. In the farthest, darkest stall, a shape. It was not an animal. It was a person, huddled against the back wall, drawn into a tight ball. He took a step closer, his boots silent on the dusty floor. The shape flinched, a small, convulsive movement, but made no sound. He stopped at the opening of the stall. It was a woman. Her dress, once perhaps a decent calico, was torn and filthy, hanging in rags off one shoulder. Her hair was a matted tangle, caked with dirt and something dark. One eye was swollen completely shut, the skin around it a sickening map of purple and yellow. Her bare feet were bruised, her ankles raw, but it was her hands, her wrists, that made Rowan's blood run cold. A heavy iron chain was looped around a thick support beam. At the end of it, an old, rusted manacle was clamped shut around her right wrist. Her left hand was free, and she was using it to clutch the rags of her dress to her chest, her knuckles white. She looked, he thought, about 28, though it was hard to tell through the abuse. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the sliver of light from the barn door, as if willing herself to be anywhere else. Scars, old and white, patterned the skin of her wrists, stark against the fresh, raw chafing of the iron. "Crowder!" a voice boomed from the barn entrance, shattering the silence. Rowan didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the woman, watching her curl in on herself, a movement of pure, instinctual terror. Wyeth Crowder filled the doorway, a big man running to fat, his suspenders straining over a stained undershirt. He was silhouetted against the bright afternoon, a smirk splitting his face. He held an ivory-handled knife, not drawn for a threat, but using it to clean his fingernails, a gesture of casual, proprietary ownership. "Well now, hail," Crowder drawled, sauntering in. "Didn't expect to see you poking around my stock." Rowan turned his head slowly. He let his gaze drift from Crowder to the knife and back to the man's watery eyes. "I came about the horse." Crowder laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. He gestured with the knife toward the stall. "Horse, hell. I got better than horses." He walked closer, stopping just outside the stall, close enough for the woman to smell the stale whiskey on his breath. She pressed herself so hard against the wall, it seemed she might pass through the wood. "This here," Crowder said, his voice dropping to a conspirator's whisper, "is salvage. Found her after a wagon train got hit by breeds up on the Red Hollow Flats. Only one left. Waste to let good stock go." He called her stock. He called her salvage. Rowan felt a cold, clean rage settle over him, clarifying his thoughts, slowing his pulse. He had seen this before. Not just the cruelty of war, but the cruelty of men who believed they had the right to own other people. He looked at the woman again, her one good eye, a deep, desperate blue. Met his. It held no plea for rescue. It held only a vast, hollow emptiness. Rowan Hale knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that he was not here to buy a horse. "She for sale, then?" Rowan asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Crowder's eyes lit up with a greedy spark. He'd mistaken Rowan's coldness for a haggler's interest. "Now you're talking. She's seasoned. Won't give you no trouble." He nudged the woman's bare foot with the toe of his boot. She didn't react. "A man like you, alone out at Juniper Crossing, could use the company. Keep the house warm." Rowan let the silence stretch, his gaze fixed on the manacle. The iron ring bolted to the wall was old. The wood around it splintered. "How much for the chain?" Crowder blinked, the smirk faltering. "The what?" "The chain," Rowan repeated, patience thinning. "I don't like the idea of it, but I like the idea of busting up your wall to get it off even less. I'll buy the chain and the lock. You give me the key." For a second, Crowder looked confused. Then his face darkened. Suspicion replacing greed. He'd been played, and he knew it. His thumb stroked the ivory handle of the knife. "You think you're smart, Hale coming here, judging my business. I'm just here to make a purchase," Rowan said. He took a slow step back, moving away from the stall, drawing Crowder's attention away from the woman. "Name your price for the hardware." Crowder's eyes narrowed to slits. He glanced at the woman, then back at Rowan. He saw a quiet rancher, a man known for keeping to himself. He didn't see the soldier underneath. $20, he sneered, naming an absurd price for a piece of rusted iron. "That's high," Rowan said. He didn't argue. He reached into his vest pocket, his movements deliberate, pulling out a small leather pouch. He kept his eyes on Crowder, watching the man's hand on the knife. "It's $20, or you can get the hell off my land." Crowder growled, his confidence returning. He was bigger. He was on his own property. "All right," Rowan said. He loosened the drawstring, his left hand holding the pouch, his right hand dipping inside to pinch a few coins. He stepped closer to the threshold where Crowder stood, holding out the coins. "20 it is." Crowder's greedy eyes flickered down to the money. He reached out with his left hand to take it, the knife still held loosely in his right. It was the opening Rowan had been waiting for. The moment Crowder's fingers brushed the coins, Rowan's right hand, which had never been fully in the pouch, shot out. It wasn't a fist. It was a solid wall of bone and calloused flesh, driven by the full, coiled power of his shoulders and back. It was not a brawler's sloppy swing. It was a soldier's calculated, disabling blow. The impact was a sickening, solid sound, like an axe splitting green wood. Rowan's knuckles connected with the side of Crowder's jaw. The bigger man's head snapped back, his eyes rolling up, white. His body, which had been braced for a transaction, not a fight, had no defense. Rowan put his full weight behind the blow, following through. Crowder was lifted off his feet. He flew backward off the raised threshold of the barn, crashing hard into the dusty, sun-baked yard. He landed in a heap and did not move. The ivory-handled knife, released from a grip that was suddenly boneless, spun through the air, glinting once in the harsh sunlight before falling harmlessly into the dust. Yards away, silence, absolute and profound, returned to Mesquite Hollow. Rowan Hale stood for a second, his fist throbbing, his breath steady. He looked down at the man in the dirt, then spat. Once, beside him. He flexed his fingers, turned his back on the sunlight, and walked back into the dark. He stepped back into the suffocating dark, his eyes finding the woman in the stall. She had not moved, but her one good eye was fixed on him, wide with a terrifying, fragile hope that was almost more painful to see than her injuries. "Key," Rowan said, his voice a low growl. He strode over to the unconscious Crowder and kicked him onto his stomach. He ripped the man's pockets inside out, finding a heavy ring of keys, a plug of tobacco, and a few bent coins. He ignored the rest and went back into the barn. He knelt in the straw in front of her. The manacle was a simple, heavy-duty farm implement, not a standard cuff. He tried 2 of the keys. Neither fit. The third one jammed. The lock rusted solid. "Damn it," he whispered. Not at her, but at the situation. Time was burning. He pulled his hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. It was a heavy, practical blade, well-oiled. "This will be loud," he said, more to himself than to her. He didn't try to break the manacle itself. He looked at the wall. The iron ring was held in place by 2 thick bolts, their heads sunk deep into the wooden support beam. But the wood was old. He could see rot, a dark, powdery softness around the iron. He jammed the tip of his knife into the wood beside the top bolt head. He put his shoulder against the handle and pushed, using the knife as a lever. The wood groaned and splintered, but the bolt held. He did it again, digging out chunks of soft, termite-eaten timber. The woman watched, her body tensing with every sound, every grunt of effort. She was vibrating with a fear so profound it was almost silent. "Hold on," he said. He jammed the knife in deep, angled it under the flange of the ring, and threw his entire body weight against it. There was a loud crack, a sound of tearing, and the top bolt ripped free from the rotten wood, sending a shower of splinters and dust into the air. The ring sagged, held only by the bottom bolt. Rowan didn't waste time. He attacked the second bolt, digging, prying, leveraging his strength against the decay. The woman flinched as a piece of wood struck her arm, but she made no sound. From the yard, there was a groan, a thick, wet cough. "Boss, you all right?" a voice shouted from the direction of the house. Rowan froze. He glanced at the barn door, then back at the bolt. He had seconds. "Rance, get the carbine, that bastard Hale." "He's in the barn!" Crowder's voice was a mangled roar of pain and fury. Rowan abandoned precision. He gave the knife one last, desperate shove. The wood split wide open. The entire mechanism ring, bolts, and a large chunk of splintered beam tore free from the wall. The chain, still attached to the woman's wrist, clattered heavily to the floor, its sudden weight pulling her forward onto her hands and knees. The chain was free. She was not. He sheathed the knife and grabbed the length of heavy chain. "We're leaving," he said. He didn't offer his hand to help her up. He didn't have time. He reached down, and for the first time, he touched her. His hand closed around her upper arm. It was thin, all bone and sinew, and he hauled her to her feet. She stumbled, her legs buckling. She hadn't stood in days, maybe longer, but her eyes, that one good blue eye, were blazing. She was shaking, a tremor that ran from her heels to her head. But she looked him square in the face. She understood. Rowan offered his free hand, palm up, a gesture that said, "Come with me." She did not take it. She just nodded, a single, sharp dip of her chin. It was an affirmation. It was a promise. She would not be dragged. She would run. "Back door," Rowan snapped, yanking the chain to pull her along. He knew this barn's layout. He'd studied it from the ridge. A man appeared in the bright, terrible rectangle of the main doorway. He was a lean, hollow-cheeked man in dusty overalls, and he was leveling a carbine rifle straight at them. Rowan didn't hesitate. He had no time to aim for the man. He dropped the chain, drew his revolver in a single, fluid motion, and fired. He didn't aim at the man. He aimed 3 feet above his head, at the heavy oak crossbeam that framed the barn door. The shot was an explosion in the enclosed space. The .44 caliber slug struck the dry-aged wood with the force of a hammer, blasting a fist-sized chunk of timber and a cloud of accumulated dust and wasp nests downward. The man, Rance, screamed, not in pain, but in surprise. He threw his arms up to protect his face from the sudden rain of wood splinters and filth, his vision completely obscured. The carbine discharged, its shot going wild, tearing a harmless hole in the barn's far wall. That was all the time Rowan needed. "Now," he yelled, grabbing Mara's arm again. He didn't run for the main door. He dragged her toward the small, shadowed opening at the very back of the barn, a cattle door that led to a small, enclosed holding pen. He kicked the flimsy door off its hinges. It flew into the pen with a clatter. He half threw, half lifted Mara through the opening and followed, his revolver still in his hand. His gray gelding was 20 yards away, tied to the wobbling post. Between him and the horse was open ground. From the house, he heard more shouting. There were at least 2 more men. "Get the horses! Rance! Get the damn horses! He's not getting away with my property." Crowder was on his feet, holding his shattered jaw, his voice a gargled testament to his rage. Rowan ran. He pulled Mara with him, the heavy chain dragging in the dirt behind her. She fell, her weak ankle turning on a rock. Rowan didn't stop. He scooped her up. She weighed nothing. He slung her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry and sprinted the last 10 yards to the horse. He unlashed the reins with one hand, his other arm clamped around her legs. He threw her up onto the saddle. She landed awkwardly, sprawling across the seat, crying out as the manacles slammed against the pommel. "Hold on!" he commanded. He grabbed the heavy leather saddlebag, filled with his own supplies, and ripped it free from the saddle. "Balance!" he shouted at her, shoving it into her stomach. He needed his weight on the back. A bullet zipped past his ear, a high, angry wasp sound. Rance was out of the barn, reloading his carbine, fumbling with the cartridges. Another man was on the porch of the house, firing a pistol, his shots wild and panicked. Rowan didn't use the stirrup. He put his left hand on the cantle, his right on the horse's rump, and vaulted up behind Mara, landing astride the gray's powerful haunches. He grabbed the reins from under her arms, his chest pressing hard against her back. She was trembling like a leaf in a high wind, but she was clutching the heavy saddlebag to her chest, doing as she was told. He dug his heels into the gray's flanks. The old horse, sensing the urgency, the smell of gunpowder, lunged forward, moving from a dead stop to a gallop in 2 powerful strides. They rocketed past the dry water trough, heading not for the main road, but for the open country, the broken, uneven ground that would destroy a wagon. A bullet tore through the brim of Rowan's hat, spinning it from his head. He didn't notice. He leaned low over Mara, shielding her small frame with his own, his jaw set. They crossed the ruined fence line and plunged down the far side of a dry irrigation ditch, the steep bank momentarily hiding them from view. The gray scrambled for footing on the loose shale, then found its rhythm, pounding across the cracked bed of the ditch. Rowan kept them in the ditch for a good mile, the high, crumbling walls protecting them from view and from bullets. The shouting from Mesquite Hollow grew faint, then was swallowed by the wind and the rhythmic thunder of the horses' hooves. He didn't slow down. He knew this land. He knew Crowder's land backed up against a maze of canyons and washes. He pushed the gray hard, turning into a narrow, winding cut in the earth, a place called Dry Willow Wash. The sandy bottom was soft, and it would mask their tracks, swallowing the horses' hoofprints almost as soon as they were made. He rode for another 20 minutes, pushing the horse, pushing the fading light, until the wash opened up onto a small, flat mesa dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. He finally pulled the gelding to a stop behind a tall dune of wind-blown sand, a place that gave him a clear view of the wash they had just left, but kept them hidden. The horse stood, sides heaving, blowing hard, its coat lathered in sweat. Rowan slid off, his boots sinking into the soft sand. He reached up for the woman. "We're safe, for now." She didn't move. She was frozen, her hands still locked around the saddlebag, her one good eye staring, unblinking, at the dark line of the horizon. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer, but still firm. "You need to get down." She seemed to unlock. Her arms went limp. The heavy saddlebag fell to the ground. She swayed, and he caught her as she pitched forward, lifting her from the saddle. Her legs wouldn't hold her. He carried her the 2 steps to the base of the dune and set her down gently, her back against the sand. He turned back to the horse, his movements all economy and purpose. He unstrapped his canteen, checked the gray's legs, and then scanned their back trail. Nothing. No dust. No riders. Not yet. He went to her. He uncorked the canteen and knelt in front of her. She flinched as he moved, a small, terrified jerk. "Water," he said. He held it out. She looked at the canteen, then at him. Her free hand, her left, came up, shaking so badly she couldn't take it. He saw the filth, the broken nails, the raw knuckles. Rowan sighed, a quiet breath. He moved closer, sliding one arm behind her shoulders to support her, and lifted the canteen to her lips. She drank. She drank with a desperate animal thirst, water spilling down her chin, dark tracks in the dust on her skin. When she finished, she coughed, a dry, rasping sound. Rowan let her rest, then reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a piece of hardtack, hard as a shingle, and his own tin cup of cold coffee left over from breakfast. He broke a piece of the hardtack, dipped it into the coffee to soften it, and held it out. She stared at the food as if she didn't know what it was. Then, slowly, she took it. Her fingers grazed his, her skin ice cold. She ate slowly, mechanically, her jaws working, but her eyes never left the horizon. She was watching the trail back to Crowder's, her body braced for the return of the nightmare. They sat in silence for a long time. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The wind turned cool. "Don't," she whispered. Her voice was so low, so hoarse from disuse. He almost missed it. "What's that?" She turned her head, her good eye finding his. The swelling on the other side of her face had begun to weep. "Don't," she said, her voice cracking, gaining a terrible strength. "Don't take me back there. Please, don't take me back." It was the first thing she had said. A plea. Rowan looked at her. He saw the caked blood, the torn dress, the ruined eye. He looked at her right wrist. The manacle was still there, the heavy chain pooled in the sand beside her. And he saw what he had only glimpsed in the barn. The skin beneath the iron was raw, bloody, but above it and below it, her wrist was a geography of old pain. White, puckered scars overlapped with yellowing, weak old bruises and newer, angry red welts. It was a pattern of long, sustained, methodical cruelty. This was not the work of a few days. It was the work of a habit, not an accident, a cold, dark fury, different from the hot rage of the fight, settled in his chest. He looked from her wrist to her face. He met her gaze, and his own was as hard and unforgiving as the land around them. "No," Rowan Hale said. "Ale, I'm not taking you back. I'm taking you to my place. I'm taking you home." He rode for 2 hours, keeping the gray at a steady, ground-eating walk, moving north by the stars. The woman, Mara, was a dead weight against his back, her breathing shallow and ragged. The heavy chain was coiled and tied to the saddle horn, the manacles still locked to her wrist, the splintered piece of wood dangling from it like a grotesque trophy. She had not spoken again. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her head occasionally slumping against his shoulder. Each time it did, he felt a jolt, not of annoyance, but of a fierce, unwelcome responsibility. He was a man who had spent the last 5 years trying to be left alone, and in one afternoon, that was over. Juniper Crossing appeared as a dark shape against a slightly less dark hill. It was not a grand ranch, just 160 acres of hard-won ground. A small, tight log house, a smaller barn, and a well lined with river stone. The place was silent, but it was a different silence from Mesquite Hollow. This was the quiet of solitude. Not of menace, it was the quiet of a home that had lost its heart. The cottonwood by the door hadn't heard a child's laugh since Rowan's sister, Eliza, had succumbed to the fever 3 years prior. The sound had died with her, and Rowan had let the silence settle in, a shroud against his own grief. He dismounted at the trough, the gray blowing in relief. He slid Mara from the horse before she could fall, his arms catching her easily. She was lighter than a feed sack. He carried her to the porch, the heavy chain clanking with every step, a sound that felt like a desecration in this quiet place. He pushed the door open with his boot. The house was one large room, with a smaller sleeping room partitioned off in the back. It was clean, sparse, and smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and leather. He laid her gently on the simple rope-strung cot that served as his own bed in the main room. She curled onto her side, her good eye fluttering open, taking in the alien shadows of the cabin. "You're safe," he said. The words sounded foreign in his own house. He didn't wait for a reply. He moved with the economy of a man long used to his own company. He lit the kerosene lamp, the sudden yellow light throwing his shadow, large and protective, against the wall. Then he went to the wood stove, stirred the embers from the morning, and added fresh kindling. The flare of the new fire was the only warmth in the room. He filled a heavy kettle from the water barrel and set it on the stove to heat. While it hissed, he went to a large wooden chest at the foot of the back room's bed. His sister's room. He opened it. The scent of dried lavender and cedar rose up, a painful memory. He pulled out a simple, dark blue wool dress and a clean cotton chemise. They were plain, serviceable, and clean. He laid them, along with a bar of harsh lye soap and a worn, clean rag, on a stool. When the water was steaming, he poured it into a large tin basin. He brought the stool, the basin, and the clothes and set them just inside the main room, near the cot where she lay watching him. "There's water," he said, his voice low. "Clothes," he pointed. "That room in the back. It's private. I'll be on the porch. The door has a latch." He turned and left, pulling the heavy plank door shut behind him, leaving her alone with the light and the hot water. He sat on the porch steps, his rifle across his knees, and stared out at the dark shape of Pale Mesa. He was giving her space, a small kingdom of privacy, the first she had likely known in months. Inside, Mara pushed herself up. Every muscle screamed. She looked at the basin, the steam rising like a ghost. She looked at the clothes. She looked at the closed door to the back room. She moved, crawling at first, then pushing herself upright, her legs shaking violently. She dragged the heavy chain. She picked up the basin. It was heavy, and her good arm trembled, but she carried it into the back room and wedged the door shut with a small chair. It was Eliza's room. Simple, like the rest of the house, but with a small, cracked mirror on the wall and a braided rag rug on the floor. Mara set the basin on the floor. She unhooked the rags of her dress, her fingers fumbling, clumsy. They fell away. Pooling at her feet in a filthy pile, she stood, naked and shivering. In the lamplight, she looked at her reflection. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, a creature of dirt and angles, her ribs stark, her skin a canvas of bruises. The deep, angry purple of new wounds lay over the faint, sickly yellow of old ones. She touched the swollen, shut mass of her right eye. She did not weep. The part of her that could weep had dried up weeks ago. She dipped the rag into the hot water, wincing as the heat stung her cold skin. She began to wash. She scrubbed away the filth of Crowder's barn, the grime of the trail. She scrubbed at the scent of stale whiskey and fear. The water in the basin turned to mud. She washed her hair, the lye soap stinging her scalp. But the pain was a clean one, a pain she had chosen. With each pass of the rag, a layer of the nightmare was stripped away. The water washed away the dirt, but it made the bruises stand out, stark and undeniable. She saw herself, not as stock or salvage, but as Mara. Her body was a map of what had been done to her, but it was her body. Her focus returned. The hollow-eyed creature in the stall was gone, replaced by a woman made of ice and old iron. When she was done, she dried herself with a rough towel she found, the coarse fibers abrasive, real. She put on the chemise, the clean cotton a shock against her skin. The wool dress was big, but it was whole, and it was warm. She felt, for the first time in an age, human. She sat on the edge of the small bed, the heavy manacle a cold, constant reminder. She could be clean, but she was not free. After a long time, she heard his boots on the porch, a soft knock. "Ma'am?" "Yes," she said. Her voice was a dry croak. He pushed the door open. He had a metal file in one hand and a small ball-peen hammer in the other. He stopped, his gaze taking in the clean dress, the damp hair combed back with her fingers, the terrible, vivid colors of her face. "The chain," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't place. He motioned to the manacle. "We need to get that off." He brought the lamp closer, setting it on the floor. "This is going to be loud," he said, echoing his words from the barn. "And it will hurt. The file will make heat, and the jarring, I'm sorry for it." He knelt. "Give me your wrist." She hesitated. This was an act of trust beyond anything she thought she had left. To give her hand to a man, but his eyes were steady. They were not kind, they were too hard for that, but they were clear. They held no malice and no desire. They held only purpose. She extended her arm. The heavy cuff clanked. He didn't touch her skin. Not at first. He examined the manacle. Heavy iron, riveted. He slid a small block of wood under the cuff to protect her skin as best he could. "I have to file through the pin." He set the file to the metal. The sound was a high, thin screech that set her teeth on edge. He worked with a steady rhythm. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The smell of hot metal and iron filings filled the small room. He was right. It hurt. The file heated the iron. A dull, burning pain that radiated up her arm. Every few minutes, he would stop, blow the metal dust away, and look at her, not her face, her hand, which she had clenched into a fist, her knuckles white. "Almost," he'd murmur, and begin again. The filing was not enough. The rivet was too thick. "I have to strike it," he said, his voice grim. "It's going to jar you. Do not pull away." He set a small, hard chisel, a tool she hadn't seen him bring in, against the groove he had filed. "Now," he said. He struck the chisel with the hammer. It was not a hard blow, but a sharp, precise one. The impact shot up her arm, a vibration of pure agony that rattled her teeth. She cried out, a small, choked sound. "Again, I'm sorry," he said. He struck it again, and again. A crack. He dropped the hammer and picked up the file, working furiously at the new split. He jammed the file into the crack and twisted. With a sharp, metallic snap, the rivet head broke. The manacle sprang open, its two halves falling away from her wrist. It fell to the floor with a heavy, final clank. Mara stared at her arm. The raw, red, indented skin. The sudden lightness. The freedom. Blood, dark and slow, began to well up where the iron had been. She didn't move. A single, hot tear, the one she thought she'd lost, escaped her good eye and traced a clean path through the fading grime on her cheek. Rowan stood up. Gathering his tools, he said nothing. He left the room and returned with a strip of clean cloth and a small tin of salve. He knelt again. "This is for the raw parts," he said. He gently, his touch surprisingly light, applied the salve to her wrist and wrapped it in the cloth. His large, calloused fingers were efficient, secure. When he was done, he stood. The task was finished. They sat at the small kitchen table in the main room. He had made coffee and a thin broth from dried jerky, and she drank it from a tin mug. The silence stretched, but it was no longer an empty one. "My name," she said, her voice stronger now. "It's Mara Linley." He nodded, sipping his own coffee. "Rowan Hale. I was a teacher," she said, as if the words were from a different life. "At the Harbor Street School, in Cincinnati." He waited. He knew she needed to say it, to trace the line from there to here. "My aunt and uncle, their family. We were going to Oregon, the Oregon slope. They had family there." She looked down at her wrapped wrist. "We were on the Red Hollow Flats. It was not Indians. They faked it. Arrows and a few whoops. But they were white men. Scavengers. They took everything." Her voice dropped, the shame and horror coiling in her words. "They took the wagon, the horses. They killed my uncle when he tried to stop them." "Crowder," Rowan said. It was not a question. "He came later," she whispered. "He and his men, they were picking over what the first ones left. He found me, hiding." She looked up, her good eye burning with a cold fire. "He called it salvage." Rowan's hand tightened around his cup. "I wasn't the first," she said, the words barely audible. "In the barn, there were marks on the wall. Other names? Scratched in." She closed her eye. "He talked. When he was drunk, he sold them. The other girls. He mentioned a place, Bayou St. Marthe, New Orleans. He said they were gone." She had said it, the full, awful truth of the place. Rowan stood. He took the empty mug from her hand. He walked to the back room and pulled the simple mattress from his sister's bed. He brought it out and laid it on the floor of the main room, by the stove. "You take the bed," he said, gesturing to the back room. "The door latches from the inside. No one will come through it." He made a simple pallet for himself on the floor. His rifle and his revolver laid on the floor beside it, within easy reach. He was placing himself between her and the door, between her and the world. She stood, but didn't move to the room. "He'll come for you," she said. "For me. You hit him. You stole his property." Rowan finished for her, his voice flat and cold. "Let him come." He blew out the lamp, plunging the cabin into the near dark of the embers and the moonlight. From the window, Rowan could see the black, jagged silhouette of the pale mesa. The night was alive with the yipping of coyotes, a lonely, hungry sound he heard every night. But tonight, it sounded different. It didn't sound like hunger. It sounded like a debt. Coming due, a promise of blood for blood. Neither of them slept. Not truly. They drifted in a state of high-strung, exhausted wakefulness. Sometime after midnight, when the fire had died to dull red coals and Rowan's breathing had deepened into a light doze, Mara slipped from the bed. She was silent, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She moved not to the door, not to the window, but to the simple wooden rack on the wall. Rowan's Winchester rifle rested there. She lifted it. The weapon was heavy, but she balanced it with an unexpected familiarity. Her bruised fingers moved with a life of their own. She didn't just hold it. Her thumb found the hammer, pulling it back to half-cock. Her index finger brushed the trigger. With her other hand, she worked the lever, just enough to check that a brass cartridge was seated in the chamber. She knew what she was doing. The teacher from Cincinnati, in a borrowed dress, in a dark cabin in a hostile land, was checking her weapons. She was ready for class. The first light of dawn was a hard, gray line that did nothing to warm the land. Rowan was already by the well, his movements stiff. He hadn't slept, but he hadn't rested either. He had sat on his pallet, a sentinel, listening to the small, broken sounds of Mara's breathing from the back room, the sharp intake of a nightmare, the long, shuddering sigh of its passing. He had milked his one cow and was washing his face in the trough when the hoofbeats came. He didn't reach for his gun. He knew that rhythm. It was a single rider, unhurried, on a good horse. A few minutes later, a figure crested the small rise. It was a person in a duster and a flat-brimmed hat, riding easy, a milk can strapped to their saddle. The rider pulled up, dismounted, and pushed back the hat, revealing the pinned-up, practical braid of Deputy Nora Bell. Nora, the sole law in Cobbler's Ford, was a woman in her 40s with a face that had seen too much sun and too much stupidity. She wasn't just a woman with a badge. She was the only one who'd been tough enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to keep it. She and Rowan had an understanding, built on mutual silence and the occasional trade of milk for cartridges. "Morning, Rowan," she said, her voice like gravel. She unhooked her milk can. "Thought you'd forgotten the sun was coming up." "Nora," he acknowledged, nodding. He went to the small spring house to get her the jar of fresh milk. When he turned back, the front door of the cabin was open. Mara was standing in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the dim interior. She was holding the coffee pot, her intent clear to offer a guest what hospitality she could. She took one step onto the porch, into the unforgiving morning light. Nora Bell, in the act of strapping the milk jar to her saddle, froze. Her hand stopped, her head turned. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, swept over Mara. She saw the clean, oversized wool dress, and she saw what the dress couldn't hide: the grotesque, multicolored swelling of her face, the split lip, and the clean, white bandage wrapped expertly around her right wrist. Nora's eyes, which had been the color of the dusty plains, darkened to the color of a storm cloud. She said nothing. She finished securing the jar, her movements suddenly economical and angry. She turned, not to Rowan, but to the woman on the porch. "Who did that to you?" Nora asked. Her voice wasn't kind. It was cold, flat, and dangerous. Mara flinched, her good eye looking to Rowan, as if for permission to speak. Rowan stepped forward, placing himself on the porch, but not in front of Mara. Beside her. "Her name is Mara Linley." Rowan said, "I found her yesterday at Wyeth Crowder's place." Nora's face went utterly still. She looked from Rowan to Mara's wrist, and back to Rowan. "Crowder, I should have known." She let out a long breath, her gaze distant. "He's been selling horses, unusually cheap, to a string of southern traders, men I don't like the look of. They pass through, always at night. They're not just buying horses," Rowan said quietly. "I know," Nora snapped, her frustration evident. "I've suspected for a year. The money's dirty. I've tracked the drafts, or tried to. They all end up at an exchange in Bayou St. Martha, but suspicion isn't evidence. Rowan, it's just a gut ache." "He was selling people," Mara said. Her voice was low, but it cut through the morning air with the clarity of breaking glass. Both Nora and Rowan turned to look at her. She was trembling, but her chin was up, her one good eye fixed on the deputy. He had others, before me. He sells them. He told me." "To New Orleans," Mara said. "The name of the city, Bayou St. Martha," clicking into place. Nora looked at the ground, kicked at a stone, and swore, a short, vicious word. "A living witness," she muttered. "That's something." She looked up, her face grim. "But it's not enough, ma'am, not for a court. It's your word, a found woman, against his, a landowner. You have any idea how many judges are in his pocket? So you'll do nothing?" Rowan's voice was hard. "I didn't say that," Nora shot back. "I said a court won't do anything. I'm one deputy with one badge and a territory the size of Delaware. To bring him down, to get the men he answers to, I don't need a witness. I need a smoking gun. I need his books, a ledger, something that proves the transactions. The three of them stood in silence. The problem laid bare, a fortress and no key. A loose board, Rowan said, his voice quiet. Nora and Mara looked at him. What? In the barn, Rowan said, his eyes distant as he pictured the stall. The stall she was in. The floor was uneven. One of the boards. It was loose. I remember my boot catching on it when I went in. Mara's head snapped up. The shrine, she whispered. What shrine? Rowan asked. In the corner of the barn, near that stall, there was a crate. He kept bottles on it. A liquor shrine. He called it, after he'd been drinking. He'd go there. He had a lantern, and he would write. Her eyes focused, the memory sharp and painful. He would write in a book, a big one, with a blue leather cover. He'd make notes, then put it under something. I always heard a sound, a scraping sound. Wood on wood. Rowan and Nora locked eyes. The loose board, the liquor shrine, the ledger. It's still just a story, Nora said, but her voice had a new edge, a new hope. We can't just ride in there. After what you did, Rowan, that place will be locked down tighter than a drum. Crowder will have guards, Rance, and probably a few more from his payroll. We'd need to get in quiet, Rowan agreed. Quieter than I can be. He stared north, toward the high, broken canyons. I know a man. Nora's eyebrows shot up. You don't mean... He'll do it, Rowan said. Or he won't, but he's the only one who can. Rowan left an hour later. He left his rifle, the Winchester, with Mara. Nora will be back, he'd said. She'll check on you. Keep the door latched. He'd pointed to the rifle. You know how to use it. It was a statement, not a question. She had just nodded, her hand resting on the smooth, oiled stock. Rowan rode for 2 hours, not toward town, but up into the high, rocky tablelands where the Kiowa had once camped. He found Tehan Cutter skinning a rabbit by a small, smokeless fire. Tehan was a man who lived between worlds. Kiowa by birth. He'd been raised in a mission school, served 5 years as a scout for the army at Fort Ansel, and had then, one day, simply walked away from the white man's world and from his own. He lived in the hills, trapping, hunting, and watching. He saw everything, and he spoke to no one, except, sometimes, Rowan. He watched Rowan approach, his hands never stopping their work. He was ageless, his face a mask of sun-baked leather, his eyes holding a profound, patient stillness. Rowan Hale, Tehan said. His voice was soft, but carried. You bring trouble. I do, Rowan said, dismounting. He didn't waste time. He told the story. He told it all. The barn, the chain, the woman, the ledger. He left nothing out. Tehan listened, his eyes on his work. When Rowan finished, Tehan was silent for a long time, wiping his blade clean on a handful of grass. You asked me to help you. Tehan said, it was not a question. To help this white woman. I ask you to help me stop him. This is not my fight. Rowan, your laws, your crimes, they are just wind in the rocks to me. It's not about laws. Tehan, it's about a man putting another human in a chain. It's about... stock. Rowan used the word, and it tasted like ash in his own mouth. Tehan stopped. He looked up, and for the first time, his eyes met Rowan's. He had seen the stock pens at the forts, the way the army moved his own people. The word had a meaning for him. You are a rancher. Hale, Tehan said slowly. You put fences around the land. You put brands on cattle. This Crowder, he just builds a different fence. This is different, Rowan said, his voice low and fierce. And you know it. Tehan stared at him, his gaze seeming to pass right through him. Finally, he nodded. Once. I will not do this for you, Rowan Hale, or for your deputy, or for the woman. I will do this because any man who casts a shadow so dark that it blots out the sun for another... He must pay with his own light. It is the balance. He stood, a compact, powerful man. Tomorrow night, the moon will be late. We will go. They were all gathered on the porch of Juniper Crossing that evening. The sun was setting, bleeding fire over the plains. Nora had returned, this time not in uniform, but in denim pants and a man's shirt, a rifle in her saddle scabbard. Tehan sat on the porch rail, a silent shadow. "The plan is simple," Tehan said, his voice for the first time seeming to include them all. "Rowan, you and I go in, from the south ridge, down the arroyo. The wind is from the north. They will not smell the horses. They will not hear us. We go to the barn. And us," Nora said, motioning to herself and Mara. "You wait," Tehan said. "You wait by the main road, at the Dry Willow Wash cutoff. You are the law. You are there to witness a lawful discovery. If we are not back in 1 hour from the time we leave the horses, you ride for the territory marshals." "But," he added, his eyes on Rowan, "we will be back." Nora nodded, accepting the logic. "If you find that ledger, Rowan, if you find it, get it to me. Once it's in my hands, with my seal on it as evidence. God himself can't take it from the county lockup." She patted a heavy leather satchel. "I'll be ready to make it lawful. Or," she added, her eyes glinting, "lawfully unlawful." The plan was set. A tense, brittle silence fell. Mara, who had been listening, turned and went inside. She came back a moment later with a piece of paper and a small charcoal pencil, items from her meager teacher's bag that had somehow, impossibly, survived. She handed them to Rowan. "You should write a note," she said. He looked at her, confused. Note. To Nora. In case you are delayed, you must write down what you are looking for, and why. Your words must be clear. Short sentences, no emotion, just the facts. It is a contingency." Rowan, a man who could break another man's jaw with one blow, looked down at the small pencil, completely at a loss. He had not written a letter in 5 years. "Here," she said gently. She sat on the steps, and in the fading light, she, the broken woman, taught the hard man how to write. Start with, "On this date, I am acting on information." Make the words clean. "Rowan, the way you clean your rifle, no wasted parts." While they worked, Rowan's large, clumsy hand forming the letters. He looked at her wrist. The bandage was gray with dust. "You need to change that," he said. He got his tin of salve. "I'll show you. You have to keep it clean. And, at night, when you wake up." He saw her look of surprise. "I hear you. When the panic comes, you're breathing wrong. You're trying to take in too much air. You have to breathe out. Slow. Count," he said, embarrassed. "Breathe in for 4. Hold for 4. Breathe out for 6. It slows the heart." She looked at him, this quiet, violent man, and nodded. "In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 6. A contingency." On the porch rail, Tehan Cutter stood up. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the fire pit. On the smooth, worn wood of the porch floor, he began to draw. It wasn't a map a white man would draw. There were no squares, no roads. He drew circles for the wind. He drew lines for the shadow paths, the places where a man could walk, unseen. 10 feet from a guard. He drew an X where the dogs were tied, and another to mark the loose board on the chicken coop that always rattled. He was drawing a map of the senses, a way to move through the world without disturbing it. "Tomorrow," Tehan said, pointing to a spot on the map. "We will walk the shadow, and we will see what light we find." The night was a shroud, moonless and thick, the stars sharp, cold pinpricks in a black velvet sky. The plan had changed. It had changed the moment Mara, her face set in the grim light of the dying campfire, had said, "I know the sound of the board. I can find it in the dark." Tehan had looked at her, a long, assessing gaze, and then nodded once. She was not a liability. She was the key. So now, 3 figures moved through the salt grass, low to the ground, more like shadows than people. Tehan Cutter went first, a ghost in the darkness. He seemed to read the earth with his hands, his moccasins making no sound. Rowan followed, his own movements practiced and heavy, his rifle held low across his chest, and behind him, her breath controlled in for 4, hold for 4. Out for 6 was Mara. She carried Rowan's Winchester, the weight of it familiar, a strange counterbalance to the terror that was a cold knot in her stomach. They crawled. The ground was cold, damp, and smelled of alkali. They were 100 yards from the silent, dark mass of the mesquite hollow buildings. Tehan paused, his hand raised. He reached into a small pouch at his belt and pulled out a length of thin sinew, tied to a tiny, hollowed-out bird bone that held a single copper bead. He strung it between 2 clumps of sagebrush. A low, invisible line, he whispered, the sound barely a breath. The wind trap. If it rings, the wind has changed, or someone has crossed our back trail. We listen for it. He led them not to the main buildings, but in a wide, circuitous loop, coming up behind the barn, using the sagging, broken-down corral fence as his final line of approach. The back door, the one Rowan had kicked open, was still a dark, gaping hole. A single lantern burned on the porch of the main house, 50 yards away. It cast a weak, yellow circle of light. They could hear the low murmur of voices, at least 2 men, and the clink of a bottle. Rance, and another hand, left on sloppy guard duty. Tehan pointed to the barn. He held up 2 fingers, he and Rowan. Then he pointed to Mara. He indicated the corner of the corral, a deep shadow where the fence met a pile of old lumber, a sniper's nest, a watch post. Mara shook her head. A single, decisive motion. She pointed at the barn, then at herself. Her face, in the faint starlight, was a mask of determination. She would not be left behind. She would not wait in another shadow while men decided her fate. She would be the one to point to the spot. Tehan's eyes narrowed. It was a risk, a terrible risk. Rowan started to object, but Tehan silenced him with a hand gesture. The Kiowa looked at Mara, at the way she held the rifle, at the set of her jaw. He saw not a victim, but a survivor who had been pushed past fear and into a realm of cold. Calculated purpose. He nodded. One slow, final dip of his chin. The 3 of _ would go. They moved across the last stretch of open ground in 3 separate, flowing movements, timing their steps to the rustle of the wind. They reached the side of the barn, pressing themselves against the rough, splintered wood. The air smelled of hay and old manure, a scent that made Mara's stomach clench. Tehan was the first one through the opening, his knife in his hand, a black shape melting into blackness. Rowan followed, revolver drawn, and guided Mara in with a hand on her back. Inside, the darkness was absolute, suffocating. It was filled with the ghosts of Mara's terror. She could smell the rust, the old straw, the faint, coppery tang she remembered. Her breathing hitched, the 4 count forgotten. She was back. She was chained. A hand, large and calloused, found hers in the dark. Not to pull her, not to restrain her, but simply to hold. Rowan's hand. It was an anchor. She felt his grip, steady and real. She took a breath. She let it out. For 6. She found the 4 count again. Rowan released her hand. She heard a faint scrape, and a tiny, shielded light flared. Tehan had a small miner's lamp, the flame barely the size of a thumbnail. Its shutter opened just a crack. He played the light on the floor, not the walls. It illuminated the stall, her stall. The support beam was a jagged mess where Rowan had torn the ring out. The floor was covered in straw. Mara stepped into the stall, her body screaming at her to run. Her legs felt weak, her knees threatening to buckle. This was the place of her humiliation, her despair. She could feel the ghost of the iron on her wrist. She reached out, her hand finding the rough-hewn wood of the stall divider. She gripped it, her fingers digging into the splinters. She squeezed, pouring all her fear, all her rage, all her memory into that one grip. until her knuckles were white and her whole arm shook with the strain. Then, as the tremor passed, her hand went still. She had mastered the place. It did not own her. "There," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She pointed not at the floor of her stall, but at the one next to it. "The liquor shrine. It was in the corner." Rowan and Tehan moved. The crate was still there. 3 bottles of cheap whiskey on it, one half empty. Tehan picked up a bottle, sniffed it, and set it down with a look of disgust. Rowan knelt. He ran his hands over the floorboards beneath the crate. He felt nothing, just rough sawn planking. "No," Mara said, her voice certain. "He sat here." She pointed to a spot just outside the stall. "And he wrote. And he put the book under." Rowan moved, following her direction. He felt along the edge of the boards where they met the barn's foundation. He ran his fingers over the packed dirt. And then he felt it. Not a loose board, but a wet one. "What is this?" he murmured. He held his fingers to the tiny light. They were dark, slick. "Whiskey," he said. He sniffed. "Spilled. It soaked into the wood." He looked closer. The spilled liquor had stained one board dark, but the cracks on either side of it were clean. Too clean. He took his hunting knife, slid the tip into the crack, and pried. The board didn't move. "He used his knife," Mara whispered. "A sound, a scraping, like this." She drew her finger along the wood. Rowan looked at the board again. There, in the corner, almost invisible, was a small notch, the size of a knife point. He inserted his blade. It was a latch. He pushed. A 5-foot section of the floorboard, its support cut and hinged with heavy leather, gave a soft groan and lifted an inch. Rowan looked at Tehan. The Kiowa's eyes were bright in the dim light. Rowan lifted the board. Beneath it was a shallow, hollowed-out space, lined with oilcloth. And inside, there was a book. It was a thick ledger, bound in what had once been fine blue leather, now scuffed and stained. Rowan lifted it out. It was heavy. He opened it. Tehan brought the light closer. The page was a meticulous, horrifying record. Columns, dates, a scrawled, spidery hand. June 4th, Unit 1, F.W., cleared 50. June 12th, Unit 2, N.O., cleared 80. June 20th, Unit 1, F.W., damaged. No sale. Page after page. Unit was always 1 or 2. The price changed. And the initials, F.W. and N.O. F.W. Mara breathed the name, her voice thick with venom. "Franklin Wyatt?" "Who?" Rowan asked, his eyes scanning the awful arithmetic. "Crowder talked about him. His partner, a big man from Cedar Bluff. He came to look at us." "N.O.," Rowan said. "New Orleans, Bayou St. Marthe. This is it," Rowan said. "He had the smoking gun. Hoof beats." Tehan's whisper was so soft it was almost just a movement of the air. He snuffed the light, plunging them back into total darkness. Rowan's head snapped up. He could hear it now. Riders, not 1 or 2, at least 5, and they were not on the road. They were cutting across the fields. They were coming here. "We have to go," Rowan said. He tucked the ledger under his arm. From the porch, a man's voice, not Crowder's, bellowed, "Light him up. Get a lantern in that barn. He wants it searched. Now!" The weak yellow light from the porch was suddenly augmented. A bright lantern flared to life. Then another. They were on the porch, walking toward the barn. "Tehan?" Rowan hissed. "No, wait," Tehan breathed. "The shadow path is gone. They have the entrance." A heavy beam of light, from a bull's-eye lantern, cut into the barn, sweeping across the stalls. The 3 of them pressed themselves into the deepest shadows, against the back wall. "You see anything?" "Rance," the new voice called. It was a smooth, educated voice, a city voice. "Nothing. Mr. Wyatt, just the whole hail made." Rance called back. "Franklin Wyatt. He was here." Rowan looked at the ledger, then at Mara. He couldn't run with this. He couldn't fight with this. He ripped open his vest. "This," he said, shoving the book at Mara. "Put it under your dress. The strap. Use the rifle strap." He unhooked the leather strap from the Winchester, his hands working fast. He wrapped it around her waist, over the dress, and cinched it tight, pinning the heavy book to her torso. It was clumsy, but it was secure. "Do not," he commanded. "Lose it. They're coming in," Tehan whispered. He was pointing to the other side of the barn. The main doors, the ones Rowan had entered first, were scraping open. They were being flanked. "The arroyo," Tehan said. He pointed to the small cattle door they had used for their first escape. "North, it's the only way. Go, fast." Tehan went first, a blur. Rowan pushed Mara. "Go run to the arroyo. Don't stop." "What about you? I'm behind you," he said. Mara scrambled through the small opening, the Winchester in her hand, the ledger a hard, square plate against her ribs. Rowan followed. They were in the open, 50 yards to the dry stream bed. "There!" a shout from the side of the barn. "It's the girl! She's out the back! Get her!" Crowder's voice, thick and mangled. "I want the girl, and I want my book." A shot. The bullet tore a chunk of dirt by Mara's feet. She ran. She ran as she had never run in her life, her legs pumping, her lungs on fire. Rowan was right behind her, his revolver in his hand. Tehan was at the edge of the arroyo, waving them on. "This way down." They plunged into the dry wash, sliding down the 10-foot embankment in a cloud of dust and gravel. "Wyatt's men are blocking the north and west." Rowan panted, reloading his revolver as he ran. "They're spread out. They don't know the low ground." Tehan said. He grabbed a handful of pale, gray powder from a pouch at his waist. Ash. He scattered it over their tracks on a patch of damp sand. "It hides the eye." They ran, stooped low, the arroyo walls protecting them, but they were running out of cover. The wash was getting shallower. A man appeared on the bank above them, a silhouette against the stars. Not 10 yards away, he was raising his rifle. Mara, who was in the lead, stopped. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She dropped to one knee, bringing the Winchester to her shoulder in a single, smooth motion. Her breathing was steady. In for 4. Rowan was about to fire, but Tehan put a hand on his arm. "Wait!" The man on the bank was fumbling, trying to get a clear shot. Behind him, on the porch of the house, a lantern sat on a barrel, casting a bright, clear light. Mara did not aim at the man. She aimed at the lantern. She held her breath, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was deafening in the narrow wash. The Winchester bucked against her shoulder. 50 yards away, the lantern exploded. The world was plunged back into darkness. The man on the bank cursed, his night vision destroyed. He fired blindly into the arroyo, the shot high and wide. "Now!" Tehan yelled. He grabbed a rock and hurled it hard against the far wall of the arroyo. 20 yards downstream, it clattered loudly. "He's down here!" the man shouted, and ran toward the sound. Tehan, Rowan, and Mara ran the other way, scrambling out of the wash and into a deep, tall stand of reeds. They pushed through, the thick stalks rustling, and fell, gasping, onto the dark prairie on the other side. They were out. They were free. From across the field, they heard Crowder's voice, a howl of pure, demonic rage. "Find them, I want the girl, and the book, do not let them escape." The sky above them was a deep, bruised purple, as if in answer to Crowder's oath. A low, distant rumble rolled across the plains. Dry thunder. A storm was coming, but it was not a storm of rain. It was a storm of lead. They ran the last mile back to Juniper Crossing, the old gray horse stumbling with exhaustion. Rowan and Tehan taking turns carrying Mara, who had pushed herself so far she was now a dead weight. The ledger a hard, unyielding presence against her ribs. Nora Bell was waiting at the cutoff, her horse a dark statue. She saw the 3 of them stagger out of the darkness, and she was moving before they stopped. "In the house!" she snapped, her voice cutting the night. "Rowan, get her inside. Tehan, watch the ridge." "No," Tehan said, his voice a low rasp. They are not coming. Not yet. They are angry, and a man who is angry is loud. We heard him. He will go home, drink, and gather his men. He will come with the light, or just before it. He will come organized." "That gives us 6 hours," Nora said, her mind already working. She dismounted, pulling a heavy canvas sack from her saddle. The sound of metal on metal clinked. "I came prepared. Nails, boards. I figured no matter what you found, we'd need to hold it." Inside the cabin, the lamp was lit. A small, defiant island of yellow in a sea of encroaching darkness. Nora kicked the door shut and dropped the heavy bolt. Mara, her strength gone, had slid to the floor by the table, her hands fumbling with the rifle strap, her breathing shallow. Rowan had to cut the strap from her. He pulled the heavy blue ledger free. For a moment, all 4 of them just stared at it. It was the heaviest thing in the room. "All right," Nora said, breaking the spell. She took the book, her hands almost reverent, and opened it on the table. She read the first page, her face a mask of cold, professional fury. "My God," she whispered. "Franklin Wyatt?" She looked at Rowan. "The mayor of Cedar Bluff's business partner. He was there tonight," Rowan said. "This," Nora said, slapping the book. "This is not just Crowder. This is the whole damn county, the whole territory." She looked up, her eyes hard. "They will not let us keep this. They will kill every last one of us to get it back." "Then we don't let them get it," Rowan said, his voice flat. He picked up his axe from by the door. "Nora, you and Mara handle the book. Tehan, you and I make this house a hard place to die." The work began. There was no panic, just a grim, focused energy. Nora, her duster thrown aside, her sleeves rolled up, produced a small hammer and a box of heavy nails. She and Rowan went to the first window. "Not boarded up," she said. "That's a trap. We need to see. We need to shoot." They took the boards from her sack and nailed them vertically across the window frame, leaving a narrow, 6-inch gap in the middle, a loophole. It was ugly, and it let the cold night air in. But it was defensible. They did the same to the back window. The small cabin, once a home, was becoming a pillbox, a crude fortress. While Rowan and Nora hammered, Tehan moved outside, silent as smoke. He did not bother with the main approaches. He went to the shadow paths. He had spoken of the small dips in the land, the cover of the mesquite bushes, the places an attacker would think were clever. He took with him a small pouch of spent .44 shell casings and a handful of pebbles. He strung thin, almost invisible sinew taken from his own hunting pouch, low to the ground, 2 inches off the dirt. He hung the casings, each with a pebble inside, like tiny, deadly bells. If a man crawled, he would hit them. If a man walked, he would miss them. But Tehan would see him. These were for the crawlers. Rowan joined him, the axe in his hand. "The arroyo," he said, pointing to the small, dry wash that ran 30 yards from the front of the cabin. "It's the only real cover they have." "Yes," Tehan said. "They will form up there." Rowan didn't talk. He began to work. He didn't dig a trench. He didn't have time. He went to the lip of the arroyo, the part hidden from the house, and he began to chop into the earth with the axe, and then pull at it with a shovel. He wasn't digging a hole. He was creating a false lip, a slanted, treacherous patch of loose dirt and gravel on the steep slope, a place where a man, running in the dark, would plant his foot for leverage and find nothing. He would slip. He would fall. He would make noise. He would die. Inside, the hammering had stopped. The house was secure. Mara, who had been sitting, pale and trembling, for 10 minutes, now stood. The adrenaline was back. "The book," she said to Nora. "Yes, ma'am," Nora said. "We need to save it, even if we don't." She pulled a small inkwell, a pen, and a stack of fresh paper from her satchel. "You were a teacher. You have the hand for it." She turned to the ledger. "We can't copy it all. We need the names. Wyatt, the dates, the N.O. and F.B.O. entries. The first page, the last page, and the ones with the most names." Mara sat. She dipped the pen, and her shaking hand, the one that had held the Winchester steady, began to write. She was no longer a victim. She was a court scribe, taking a deposition from hell. Nora watched her for a moment, satisfied. Then she took the original ledger. She looked around the cabin. No hiding place was safe. Not in the mattress, not under the floor. They would burn the place to the ground if they had to. She went to the kitchen supplies. She found Rowan's large 50-pound barrel of flour. It was half full. She looked at it. She went to the door and pulled a handful of dry pine needles from the ornamental bush Rowan's sister had planted. She returned to the barrel, laid the pine needles on the surface of the flour, and then gently placed the blue ledger on top of them. The needles would mask the scent of the leather, the ink, the human desperation clinging to it. Then, scoop by scoop, she buried the book in the flour, tamping it down until it was 6 inches beneath the surface. She smoothed the top, put the lid back on, and pushed the barrel back against the wall. It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. A soft knock came at the door. Rowan, Tehan, and Nora all froze, their weapons appearing in their hands. "Who is it?" Nora called, her voice a low command. It's just us. Deputy," a reedy voice called back. "It's Mrs. Gable. We saw the lights and the hammering. We brought what we had." Rowan looked at Nora, his face a question. Gable was his nearest neighbor, 2 miles down, a dirt-poor farmer with 5 children. Nora opened the door a crack. Old man Gable and his wife stood there, the woman holding a cloth-wrapped bundle, the man holding a small sack. They looked terrified, but they were there. "Ma'am, deputy." "Mrs.," Gable said, her voice shaking. We ain't much for a fight, but we heard tell Crowder's been wrong, and we know Rowan Hale is a good man. This," she pushed the bundle forward, "it's just cornbread, and..." The man held up the sack. "Salt. It's all we have." It was not just bread. It was not just salt. It was a choice. In the dark, on a cold plain, they were casting their lot. They were neighbors. It was a vote of confidence, fragile and essential. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Nora said, her voice thick for the first time. She took the bread. "Now, you must go home. Lock your doors. Do not light a lamp. Stay away from the windows. You were not here. You saw nothing. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Gable said, nodding. He looked at Rowan. "Godspeed, son." They vanished back into the night. Rowan closed the door, the heavy bolt sliding home with a sound of finality. He looked at the cornbread. It was the first sign that the world outside this cabin still existed, and that it was, perhaps, worth saving. Rowan looked at the porch. "Tehan, they'll pin us. From the arroyo to the porch, we're blind. We move from one window to the other. They'll see the shadow." Tehan nodded. Rowan grabbed the leftover boards and his hammer. He went out onto the porch. In the dark, he began to build, nailing boards from the edge of the porch roof down to the railing, creating a low, slanted awning, a false wall. It was a simple, brilliant piece of battlefield engineering. Now, a man could move from the front door to the far window, completely concealed from the arroyo, his shadow hidden, his position unknown. Tehan, meanwhile, worked inside. He took his knife and, in the wall that separated the small back bedroom from the main room, he cut 2 small, horizontal slits, talking holes, he whispered to Mara. "So we can speak, so we know." A way for the house to be won, for Nora in the back and Rowan in the front to fight as one person. The cabin was ready. It was a machine for killing and a shelter for hope. Mara had finished. Her hand was cramped, the pages of copied testimony stacked neatly. She had done her job, but there was one more. She took the original ledger, the one Nora had yet to bury. She opened it again, and she began to read. "What are you doing?" Rowan asked, stepping inside, his hammer in his hand. "I'm making a list," Mara whispered. She took her charcoal pencil and a fresh piece of paper. "The ones he called units." She began to write, and as she wrote, she spoke the names she had found scratched into the wall of her stall. "Sarah, Elspeth, Anna, Maria." Then she read from the book. The other names. The ones he hadn't bothered to write. Just the buyers. A girl to FW, another to NO. 2 girls damaged. She read each entry. She spoke each name. She was calling the roll. A teacher calling her students home. She was giving voice to the voiceless, making them witnesses, bringing their ghosts into the room to stand with them. When she finished, the cabin was silent, but it was no longer empty. It was full, full of the lost, and full of the rage of the living. "It is time," Tehan said. He was at the door, sniffing the air. "They are coming." They took their places. Nora in the back bedroom, her rifle resting in the loophole. Rowan at the front window, his Winchester ready. Tehan, a shadow by the door, his knife in one hand, his revolver in the other. Mara took her station at the side window, the one that faced the open plain, the one where they least expected an attack. She had the heavy rifle. She had 3 boxes of cartridges. Her face was calm. She had set a single candle on the far fence post. 60 paces out. A target, she'd called it. Rowan had watched her. In the last light, she had practiced. Lying, kneeling, standing. Her breath, a rhythmic whisper. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. The trigger squeeze. She didn't fire, she just practiced the motion, the breathing, the sight. Then, just once, she had fired. The shot had been sharp, clean. The candle flame, 60 paces away, had vanished, the wick broken. Her eye, Rowan had realized, was not a good eye. It was a perfect eye. Now, they waited. The wind had picked up. It was a cold wind, carrying the smell of ozone, of a storm far off, and something else, a faint, metallic tang. "The wind," Rowan said, his voice low. "It smells familiar. It is the smell of old gunpowder," Tehan said from his shadow. "It is the smell of this land, a debt from a long time ago, still on the air." He looked at the blackness outside. When the light comes, the shadow has no place to hide. Rowan racked a cartridge into the Winchester's chamber. The sound was a loud, definitive clack. "We'll make it light," he said. The first sound was not a gunshot. It was a single, high, metallic tink-tink-tink. It was the sound of a spent shell casing, dancing at the end of a thread, a pebble inside it. It came from the east, from the deepest shadows near the woodpile. Tehan, who had been a statue by the door, was no longer there. He had not made a sound. He had simply been absorbed by the darkness. "Front window, Rowan," Nora's voice came, low and steady, from the talking hole. "Back room is clear." "Mara," Rowan whispered, his voice a low rumble. "Side window. Watch the arroyo." "I see them," Mara's voice came back, shockingly calm, a teacher assessing a classroom. "They are not coming from the east. That was a diversion. They are in the arroyo, and they are crawling." The night outside, which had been silent, was now alive. It was not a charge. It was an infestation. Shapes, low to the ground, moving like, as the prompt had said, a slow, dark wildfire, spreading through the salt grass. They were not fools. They were using the land, and they were being led. Rowan could make him out, a tall man in a long coat, directing the others with hand signals, visible only for a second in the faint starlight. Franklin Wyatt. He was using his men, at least 8 of them, pushing them forward in a wide, flanking crescent, and in the center of them, moving with a drunken, lunging gait, was Crowder. He was carrying a lantern, not lit, and a heavy jug. His voice was a low, constant, slurred stream of curses, but his eyes, glinting, were sober as a snake's. They were in the open now, 100 yards out, moving from the arroyo to the flat ground. "Nora," Rowan said to the wall. "The gate. There is a lantern on the gate post." "I see it," she replied. Rowan saw the attackers, fanning out, their rifles glinting. They were just outside of effective pistol range, but well within rifle range. They were confident. They were 8. They were attacking a cabin with one known man. From the back room, a rifle cracked. The sound was sharp, a single, definitive statement. Out on the gatepost, 100 yards away, the one lantern they had, the one they were using as a rallying point, exploded. It didn't just go out. It vanished in a spray of glass and burning kerosene. The night, which had been gray, was suddenly absolute black. A yell of surprise from the attackers. A confusion. Their one point of reference was gone. The darkness, which they had been using, was suddenly total. It was no longer their ally. It now belonged to the cabin. The house was the center of the void, and they were, all of them, suddenly, terribly, blind. "Fire at nothing," Rowan whispered to Mara. "Just wait. One is breaking right." Tehan's voice came from nowhere. He was on the porch, under the new, slanted roof, but Rowan had no idea how he had gotten there. "He's lost. He's looking for the woodpile." "I see him," Mara said. "Do not shoot," Tehan ordered. "He is mine." And he was gone. Not a sound, just a presence, a shift in the air, and he was off the porch. Rowan heard a man, moving fast, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was disoriented, cut off from the main group by Nora's shot. He blundered toward the woodpile, seeking cover. "Wyatt Rance," the man whispered, his voice high with panic. Then there was a sound that did not belong in a gunfight. It was a crack, not of a rifle, but a loud, sharp snap, like a tree branch breaking in winter, but faster, tearing the air. The man screamed, a high, short shriek. There was a clatter as his rifle hit the rocks. Rowan, peering through the loophole, saw it. Tehan, a shadow against shadows, had moved like a cougar. He had not used a gun. He had used a long, coiled bullwhip, a tool from his scouting days. The crack was the popper breaking the sound barrier. The lash, in his expert hand, had wrapped around the man's rifle, yanking it from his grasp. The man, terrified, his hand stinging, turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness, a disarmed and broken threat. Tehan retrieved the rifle and, just as silently, melted back toward the house. "Fire," Wyatt's voice, furious, recovering from the shock. "Pour it on them." The world erupted. Lead hammered the front of the cabin. Bullets thudded into the logs, a sound like a giant, angry woodpecker. Splinters of wood flew into the room, stinging Rowan's face. "Stay down," he yelled, firing his own rifle into the blackness. Not at a target, but at the muzzle flashes. "They're moving! They're rushing!" Nora called from the back. But it was a feint. The heavy fire was to cover one man. Crowder. He had used the noise to sprint. His drunken lurch gone. He was at the side of the house, by the auxiliary shed, the one that held Rowan's cured hides. He had the jug in his hand. "Crowder!" Rowan bellowed. Realizing the danger, it was too late. Crowder swung the jug, smashing it against the side of the shed. It was not a jar. It was a 5-gallon clay jug of oil. The dark, viscous liquid splashed over the dry wooden shingles, running down the wall. Crowder fumbled in his pocket, produced a match, and scraped it on his boot. "Mara, the side!" Rowan roared. Mara, at her window, saw him. She saw the match flare. She aimed, but he was too close to the wall, shielded by the roof's overhang. She fired, the bullet tearing a chunk of wood inches from his head. He yelped, but he was committed. He tossed the lit match onto the oil. The world whooshed. A wall of orange flame climbed the side of the cabin, licking at the eaves. The dry shingles of the auxiliary roof caught instantly, burning with a hungry, crackling roar. "Fire! It's on fire!" Mara yelled, her voice for the first time breaking with panic. The new light was a disaster. It illuminated the cabin, turning the defenders from unseen ghosts into sitting targets. "Rowan the fire!" Nora yelled. Rowan knew. He grabbed the heavy water bucket from by the stove. He looked at Mara. "Cover me! Do not let them get to this porch!" He unbolted the door and threw it open, the water bucket in his hand. He was silhouetted against the new, terrible light of the fire. "Now! Hail!" A man's voice yelled from the darkness. "You're lit up!" A rifle shot. The bullet snapped past Rowan's head. So close he felt the heat of it. But before the man could fire again, the side window exploded with a rhythmic, pounding crack, crack, crack. Mara was standing, not kneeling. She was working the lever of the Winchester, firing as fast as she could, not at the men, but at their muzzle flashes. She was not aiming to kill. She was aiming to make them take cover. She was a teacher, rapping a ruler on a desk, demanding their attention. "Keep your heads down," she screamed. The words lost in the gunfire. The suppressing fire worked. The men who had been about to charge, seeing Rowan in the doorway, dove for cover, startled by the ferocity of the defense. Rowan ran, his head down, and threw the contents of the bucket 10 gallons of water at the base of the fire. It hissed, steam and smoke blinding him. But the main flames, the ones on the wall, died. The roof, however, was still burning. "It's not enough," he yelled. He ran back inside, grabbing a heavy horse blanket. "Mara, keep them busy." "I am," she yelled back. She was firing, reloading, firing, her movements a blur. Rowan soaked the blanket in the trough by the door and ran back out, climbing the side of the shed, using the blanket to beat at the flames on the roof. He was a perfect target. "He's on the roof," Wyatt's voice, cold and clear. "Kill him." "No," Mara said, her voice dropping, all the panic gone. A man, emboldened, rose from behind the arroyo's lip, taking careful aim at Rowan. Mara's rifle cracked. The man screamed, not in pain, but in shock, and grabbed his hat, which had just been spun from his head by a .44 slug. He looked at the hole in his hat, looked at the house, and then, with a cry of, "I ain't paid enough for this," he dropped his rifle and ran. It was Franklin Wyatt. He was out of the fight. "The roof is out," Rowan yelled, jumping down, his boots smoking. "Get back inside." The rout had begun, but Crowder was not routed. He was enraged. He had lost his men. He had lost his partner. He had lost his book. All that was left was the girl. He staggered out from the side of the house, his face a mask of soot and fury, the ivory-handled knife in his hand. He was through. He had no plan. He only had hate. He charged the front porch, a wild, bellowing animal. "Girl, you come out here, you're mine." Rowan, in the doorway, raised his rifle. He had him. "Rowan, wait," Nora's voice from the talking hole. "He's angled. I have him too." Crowder was on the steps, his chest puffed out, roaring, insane with rage. He was in the perfect, fatal center. He was in a crossfire. "Now," Rowan said. 2 rifles spoke as one. Nora's shot, from the back room, through the loophole, caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him. Rowan's shot, from the front door, was true. It hit him center mass. Crowder was not a man. He was a marionette whose strings had been cut. He was lifted off his feet by the combined impact, his body thrown backward, a dead weight, off the porch. He landed in the dirt, the ivory knife skittering from his hand, and did not move. The shooting stopped, all of it, at once. The remaining 2 or 3 men, leaderless, their partners fled, their boss, a dark shape in the dirt, simply vanished. There was the sound of running, of men crashing through the brush, and then, nothing. "Hold your fire," Nora called out. "Help, don't shoot, I'm stuck," a voice, high and pathetic, from the arroyo. Rowan, his rifle still ready, moved to the edge of the porch, Tejan appearing at his side. They looked down. One of Crowder's men, trying to flee, had run right into Rowan's trap. He had stepped on the false lip, and his leg had plunged deep into the prepared hole. Twisting, snapping, he was pinned. His rifle lay on the ground, 10 feet away. "I give," he cried, his hands in the air. "My leg's broke, don't shoot me." Rowan looked at Tejan. Tejan looked at Rowan. The silence of the high plains rushed back in, vast and profound. There was no more gunfire. There was only the sound of a man sobbing in a ditch, the rip, rip, rip of the last burning shingles on the shed roof, and the sudden, deafening, impossible to ignore thunder of 3 hearts, beating in the silence of the cabin. The adrenaline evaporated, leaving a cold, metallic exhaustion in its place. The night air, sharp and smelling of gunpowder and ozone, rushed in to fill the silence. Nora Bell was the first to move. She was all business, her face a grim mask in the first pale hint of dawn that was touching the eastern sky. She strode to the arroyo, her revolver in her hand, and looked down at the whimpering man. "You're lucky," she said, her voice flat. "You're the one who gets to live." She grabbed his good arm and, with a strength that belied her size, hauled him up out of the ditch. He screamed as his broken leg was jostled, but she didn't slow. "Rowan, I'm taking this one, and the bodies, back to Cobbler's Ford. He's my witness. He'll talk. They all talk when they're broken." She tied the man's hands, retrieved his rifle, and unhitched her horse. "Tejan," she called out, though she couldn't see him. "I'm here." His voice came from the ridge, 100 yards away. He was already on his horse, a dark shape against the graying sky. "Watch our back," she said. "I will," Tejan replied. "The ones who ran, they will not stop until they reach the next county, but I will follow them. I will see their tracks. I will know where they go." He was not speaking to Nora. He was speaking to the wind. And then he was gone, his horse making no sound as it moved over the rock. Nora looked at Rowan, who was standing, numb, in the doorway, his rifle dangling from one hand. "The book. Hale. Bury it deep. Don't dig it up until you hear from me. This is just the first inning." She mounted, leading the prisoner's horse, and rode away without looking back. A solitary, unbending line of law. The sun started to come up. It was a clear, beautiful, cold morning, the kind that felt like a mockery. The air was still, and the smoke from the smoldering shed rose in a single, lazy column. The cabin was a wreck. Bullet holes pocked the logs. The front window was a splintered hole, and the smell of stale gunfire was thick in the air. Rowan felt a sudden, sharp sting in his shoulder. He looked down. He'd forgotten. A chunk of wood, blasted from the doorframe by a stray bullet, was embedded in his upper arm. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding, a dark, slow stain spreading on his shirt. He walked, his legs feeling like they were full of sand, to the porch steps and sat down, heavily. The fight was over. The crash was here. He leaned his head against the support post, the world tilting slightly. The door opened behind him. Mara. She stood for a long moment, looking at him. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair a wild tangle. Her one good eye, which had been so clear and sharp, was now clouded with bone-deep weariness. She held a tin basin of water. She came and sat on the step below him. Not speaking, she dipped a clean rag into the water, which was steaming. She had heated it. She had added salt. "You're bleeding," she said. Her voice was a whisper. "It's nothing," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." She put the basin down and gently took his arm. He didn't resist. He was too tired. Her hands were shaking. He could feel the fine tremor as she touched the cloth to the wound. She worked with a delicate, practiced care, her movements slow, uncertain, but precise. She was a teacher. Her hands used to mending books and guiding small fingers, not tending bullet wounds. "That chunk of wood, it's deep," she murmured, her brow furrowed. "This will sting." She cleaned the wound, her touch so gentle it was almost an agony. She pulled the half-inch splinter out with a quick, decisive movement. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "No, thank you." She finished cleaning it and then, using the same roll of cloth he had used on her, she bandaged his arm, her fingers brushing his skin. The tremor was still there, a vulnerability that contrasted so sharply with the woman who had, hours before, been a machine of deadly calm. They sat in silence for a long time, the sun climbing, bringing a false, cold warmth to the porch. "The book is in the flower," he said, his voice low. She nodded. "I know. I helped Nora." "Hartwell," he said, "and Reddick, the mayor of Cedar Bluff, and Franklin Wyatt," she said, her voice turning to ice. "And all those initials, FWNO. It's a company, a business. It's a snake, he said. And we've only cut off the tail. The head is in Bayou Saint Marthe. No, she said, her voice fierce, her good eye finding his. The head is in that book. The head is the names, the dates, the proof. The rest is just the body. And we have the head, buried in flour. She looked down at her own hands, now stained with his blood. In the barn, she said, her voice so low he had to lean in. When I was chained, I made myself a promise. He waited, watching her. I promised that if I ever got out, if I ever lived, I would not be silent. I would not let it be a secret. I would tell. I would be a witness, not just for me, for Sarah and Anna, for the units in his book. She looked up at him, the first tear he had seen her shed since that first day, the one of gratitude, now welling. But I never thought I'd have someone to tell. I thought I'd just be screaming it into the dirt. Rowan looked at his own hands, calloused, scarred, stained. When my sister died, he said, his voice rough. The fever took her. I built this wall, this silence. I looked away, from the neighbors, from Cobbler's Ford, from everything. I just wanted to be left alone. He turned his head, his gaze meeting hers. Yesterday, in that barn, when I saw you, I saw what happens when men like me just look away, when we just want to be left alone. He raised his bandaged arm. I made a promise, too, out here, just now. I'm never looking away again. The silence that fell was different. It was not empty. It was full. It was the sound of two broken, separate vows, spoken aloud, suddenly weaving together, becoming one. They sat at the small kitchen table. The sun was high now. He had built a small fire in the stove to ward off the chill, the smell of wood smoke chasing away the last of the gunpowder. He had made coffee, thick and black. The space on the bench seat between them, which had been a polite, respectful distance, now felt like a chasm. She looked at his hand, the one that wasn't bandaged, resting on the table. It was a big hand, scarred from rope burns and mending fences. The hand that had hit Crowder, the hand that had held hers in the dark of the barn, slowly, deliberately. Mara reached out. She was not trembling now. Her hand, small and pale, but marked with the grit of the fight, covered his. She did not grab. She did not plead. She simply placed it. A statement, a signal, an act of profound, terrifying, and absolute agency. Rowan's breath caught. He did not move. He did not turn his hand over to grasp hers. He simply sat, letting her touch him. He was giving her the control. She slid her hand from his, and he felt a sudden loss. But she was standing. She moved, not to the back room, not to the door, but to him. She stood behind the bench, by his side. He turned his head to look up at her, and she just leaned down. She put her arms around him, her head resting on his good shoulder. It was not a passionate embrace. It was an embrace of ballast. It was an anchor. It was two survivors, clinging to the same piece of wreckage, finding that it was, in fact, an island. He raised his one good arm, his bandaged one, and put it around her waist, holding her. They stayed like that, in the middle of the ruined, sunlit kitchen, for a long, long time, just breathing. His breath, slow and steady, hers, catching, then matching his. Finally, she pulled back, just enough to look at him. His face was hard, weathered, but his eyes were clear. He was looking at her, seeing her, not the victim, not the shooter, not the teacher, just Mara. He raised his hand, the one she had touched, and his fingers, calloused and rough, gently brushed a strand of matted hair from her bruised face. His touch was a question. She leaned into it, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It was an answer. He leaned in. He kissed her. It was slow. It was respectful. It was chaste. And yet it was the most intimate thing either of them had ever known. It was not a kiss of passion, but of gratitude. It was a kiss that said, "You are alive." It was a kiss that said, "I am alive." It was a kiss that said, "We are alive, together." His lips were dry, chapped. They tasted of coffee and gunpowder. Her were the same. It was a kiss of shared survival. When he pulled away, he stopped. He searched her face, his eyes asking the question he did not know how to speak. Mara looked at him. She saw his fear, his respect, his own loneliness, and she knew she was, for the first time, completely and totally safe. She nodded, just once, a small, clear signal. "Stay," she whispered. Her voice was raw. "Stay here, with me." She did not mean the kitchen. She rested her forehead against his, her good eye closing. He put his arm around her, and he stood, lifting her slightly, and they moved as one, two parts of a whole, toward the back room. The camera, the imaginary one, did not follow. It lingered on the 2 empty coffee cups on the table. It held on the rifle, leaning in the corner. It moved, slowly, to the window, and all that was visible was the wide, cold, starry sky, and the promise of a new and very different day. In the morning, the light was clear and sharp. They woke, not slowly, but all at once, the habits of the previous night still encoded in them. They were in the small, narrow bed in the back room, fully clothed, the coarse wool blanket pulled over both of them. Mara's head was on his chest. His good arm was around her, holding her secure, and at some point in the night, in the dark, their hands had found each other. They were entwined, fingers locked, a simple, profound, and unbreakable bond. They did not speak of forever. Forever was a word for people in cities, for people who hadn't seen what they had seen. But as the sun streamed in, they held on, their hands clasped. They had made a different promise, not of forever, but of today. And they would face it, together. Rowan got up first. When he opened the front door, the air was cold and clean. Sitting on the porch step, right in the center, was a small, neatly tied bundle of deer hide. He picked it up. Inside, there were not cartridges or a warning. There was a bunch of dried, fragrant herbs, willow bark for the pain, and sage for the blessing. He looked out at the ridge, now empty in the morning light. Tehan had seen them. He had watched, and he had, in his own way, smiled. The journey to the next county, to see Judge Avery Cole, was not a flight. It was a tactical maneuver. They rode, not as refugees, but as a delegation of 3, carrying a terrible truth. Nora Bell, in her official duster, her badge polished, road point, Rowan, his rifle in his scabbard but his revolver loose in its holster, rode as her guard, and beside him, Mara, in Eliza's borrowed dress, her back straight, her face still a map of bruises but her eye clear and hard. They carried the book. It was wrapped in oilcloth, but Mara could still smell the faint, powdery scent of flour and the acrid, metallic smell of old ink. They also carried Mara's copies, every page of which Nora had signed and dated. Judge Avery Cole was not a man of the frontier. He was a man of the law, which was a rarer thing. He was old, with a shock of white hair, and eyes that had seen every lie a man could invent. He met them not in his courtroom, but in his private study in the pre-dawn dark. 2 days after the fight, Nora laid the ledger on his mahogany desk. "Judge," she said, her voice raw with the lack of sleep. "I'm Nora Bell, from Cobbler's Ford, and this is the Devil's Account book." For 1 hour, Cole listened. He did not interrupt. He looked at Mara's face as she spoke. He looked at Rowan's bandaged arm. And then, he read the ledger. He read it, page by page, his face growing paler, his jaw setting so tight the muscles in his temples bunched. When he was done, he closed the book. He looked at the 3 of them. "Deputy Bell," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the force of a gavel. "You have, at great personal risk, uncovered a rot that goes to the bone of this territory. You," he said, turning to Mara, "are a testament to the failure of the law. And you, sir, to Rowan, are a testament to what men must do when it fails. He stood. I am placing this ledger under the seal of the Territorial Circuit Court. It is now evidence in a capital crimes case. Your copies, Deputy. I am countersigning and sealing as official, binding duplicates. He took his seal and, with a heavy, final thump, he pressed it into the hot red wax. First on the oilcloth-wrapped ledger, and then on each of Mara's pages. You have, he said, given me the sword. Now, I must find a place to swing it. Word travels fast, but the news of a sealed indictment travels faster. It did not leak from Judge Cole. It leaked from the panic in Cedar Bluff. Judge Hartwell, the local magistrate, and Mayor Reddick, his partner, suddenly found their business complicated. The man in Nora's jail, the one with the broken leg, had talked, and he had named them Hartwell. A man used to wielding power from a comfortable chair made his first mistake. He sent a runner, a low-level flunky, to the Cobbler's Ford jail. The man's instructions were simple: $100 in gold for the night guard to lose the prisoner, and to burn any and all files on Nora Bell's desk. The night guard, a man named Silas, who had served with Nora for 5 years and knew her to be the only honest thing in the county, took the gold. He put it in his pocket, locked the runner in the cell next to the man he was supposed to kill, and rode to find Nora. The attempted bribe, the conspiracy to silence a witness and destroy evidence, was now part of the case. But the rot was deep. Hartwell and Reddick had more than just flunkies. They had men on their payroll, men who, like Franklin Wyatt, were now fugitives. They had to clean up the mess. They sent a wagon, a supply run, with 2 armed outriders, to rendezvous on Switchback Ridge, a place where no sane person traveled. They were to retrieve a wounded, furious man who had been hiding in a sheep herder's line shack, a man who had been shot twice but was too mean to die, Wyeth Crowder. They were not expecting Tejan. Tejan Cutter, leading a detachment of 6 county marshals from Judge Cole's district, was not waiting at the rendezvous. He was the rendezvous. He had tracked the cleanup crew for a full day. He had read their panic in their horses' tracks, seen their desperation in the way they didn't bother to hide their trail. The ambush on Switchback Ridge was not a fight. It was a legal proceeding. Tejan's men rose from the rocks, a half-dozen rifles leveled. "By the authority of the Territorial Court," the lead marshal announced, "you are under arrest." The outriders threw down their guns. In the back of the wagon, under a pile of bloody blankets, they found Crowder, his arm in a crude sling, his chest bound tight, a fever raging in his eyes. And in a locked box under the driver's seat, they found the letters. Letters from Reddick, letters from Hartwell, and receipts for payments, all signed by Franklin Wyatt. The snake was eating its own tail, and Tejan was there to hold it down. Judge Avery Cole did not summon them to his court. He brought the court to them. He arrived in Cedar Bluff on the circuit wagon, a traveling courtroom, and set up not in Hartwell's compromised courthouse, but in the town square. On the steps of the feed store, he impaneled a grand jury from the county at large, men from outside Cedar Bluff's sphere of influence. The town was packed. Word had spread like a prairie fire. Ranchers, farmers, women with their children, shopkeepers. They all came. They stood in the dust, under the hot sun, to watch a reckoning. At a table in the front sat the accused, a pale, sweating Mayor Reddick, a stunned, silent Judge Hartwell, and between them, bound in chains, his arm in a sling, his face a mask of black, impotent rage, Wyeth Crowder. "The Territory," Judge Cole announced, his voice carrying over the crowd, "calls its first witness, Mara Linley." Mara stood. She walked from the crowd, Rowan at her side. He squeezed her hand once, and then let her go. She stood before the jury, and she took the oath. She was not the trembling, terrified creature Rowan had pulled from the barn. She was not the soot-stained soldier who had held the line. She was the teacher. Her voice was clear, calm, and devastating. She did not raise it. She did not weep. She spoke with a terrible, cold precision. She told them of the date, the attack on the Red Hollow Flats, the salvage. She spoke of the barn. It smelled, she said, her voice clear, of hay and iron and old blood. She told them of the chain, of the manacle, of the brand of casual cruelty. And then she unbuttoned the cuff of her dress. Her right wrist, still raw and red, she held up for the jury to see. A woman in the crowd gasped. "But I was not the first," Mara said. She pulled out her own neat, handwritten list. "He kept a book. He called us units, but we had names: Sarah, Elspeth, Anna, Maria." A woman at the back of the crowd screamed, a raw, animal sound. "Anna, that's my sister. She was lost on the Red Hollow Flats. They said the Kiowa." The crowd erupted. Judge Cole slammed his gavel. "Order, order, the witness will continue." Mara's testimony, the facts, the dates, the cold, hard, unadorned truth, was more powerful than any a lawyer could have spun. She was not accusing. She was testifying. Rowan was next. He spoke of what he saw. "I came to buy a horse," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I found a woman, chained to a wall, being sold as stock. I did what any man should have done." Nora followed. She laid out the procedure, the finding of the ledger, the copies, the chain of evidence, the sealed book which she presented to the jury. She detailed the attempted bribe and the man in her jail cell, the one who had confessed. Then Judge Cole called Tehan Cutter. Tehan walked forward, not in moccasins, but in the army boots he had once worn. He held in his hand, not a rifle, but a bundle of arrows. "These," he said, his voice soft, yet carrying, "were found at the Red Hollow Flats, where they said the Kiowa had raided." He held one up. "The fletching is gray goose, but it is tied with linen thread, not sinew. The head is trade iron, but it is notched. No Kiowa notches a hunting arrow like this." Then he dropped the arrows and held up a plaster cast. "This," he said, "is a boot print, a size 12, worn at the heel, from a cavalry boot. I found it, and 24 others, all around the burned-out wagon. There were no moccasin tracks, not one." He looked at Crowder. "It was not a raid. It was a stage play, a lie written in blood to hide a theft." It was over in 2 hours. The grand jury did not deliberate. They walked out, and they walked back in. The foreman's hands were shaking as he read the true bill. Wyeth Crowder, Judge Hartwell, and Mayor Reddick were indicted on 27 counts of kidnapping, conspiracy, and murder. The FWNO network, the line of stock from the prairie to the parlors of New Orleans, was, for the first time, exposed to the light as the marshals clamped the irons on Hartwell and Reddick, who were weeping, and on Crowder, who was spitting curses. The crowd was silent. It was a stunned, awed silence. The governor of the territory, alerted by wire from Judge Cole, sent a special detachment of marshals to Bayou St. Marthe, armed with the names from the ledger. The list of the missing women, Mara's list, was sent to every aid station and army fort from Texas to Oregon. Franklin Wyatt, the respectable partner, had vanished. He was a ghost, but he was a ghost with a price. On every post office, on every saloon door, a new poster appeared. "Wanted Franklin Wyatt for kidnapping and murder. $1,000 reward." His elegant, smiling face stared out at every dusty road. A hunted man. That evening, as Judge Cole was packing his circuit wagon, Mara approached him. "Judge," she said, "Miss Linley, you have done this territory a service I cannot repay." "It is not about repayment, sir," she said. "It is about the book, my copies. They are evidence. My dear, they will be in the court's possession." "I know, sir," she said, "but I would ask you, when this is done, for a copy of my copy." The judge looked at her, confused. Why would you want to hold on to that?" Mara looked at the setting sun, at the dust motes dancing in the last light. "For all the ones who are not coming home," she said. "For all the units who are still just names. They They still need to be called by their right name. And I, she said, her voice dropping, am a teacher. I keep the roll. 1 year, it passed. Not like a storm, but like the slow, steady melting of a long snow. The land did not change. It was still the high, harsh, unforgiving plain. But Juniper Crossing changed. The silence that Rowan Hale had cultivated, the shroud of his grief, was gone. It had been replaced by the scrape of a bench on a wooden floor, the sharp, clear sound of a woman's voice calling out, "No, not C-A-T, it's B-O-O-K. We are learning to read the book," followed by the sound of children laughing. The Juniper Crossing School, as Mara had grandly named it, was open every Saturday. It was held in the main room of the cabin. She had 4 students from the Gable farm, and 2 more from a family over the ridge. She taught them their letters, their numbers, and, as she had promised, she taught them a new subject, how to speak the truth, even when your voice is shaking. Rowan, too, had become a teacher. On those Saturday afternoons, he took the young men, boys of 13 and 14 who were all hard hands and clumsy feet, and he taught them his own curriculum. He taught them how to safely handle a rifle, not for a gunfight, but to protect a flock. He taught them how to set a fence post so it would hold against the wind, how to read a brand, and, using the lessons Mara had taught him, how to apply a clean bandage and splint a broken bone. He was not teaching them to be hard. He was teaching them, as he had learned, how to keep things alive. The territory itself had shifted. The trial, the Cedar Bluff reckoning, as the papers in Cheyenne had called it, had sent a shockwave. Nora Bell, the one deputy who had stood, was now Sheriff Bell. She had won the election by a landslide, her name written in on ballots in 3 counties. In the Cobbler's Ford office, where the old, faded charter had once hung, there was a new one, hammered to the wall. Nora had written it herself, in plain, clear script. No one is property, no one is silenced. And Tehun Cutter. He had not returned to his quiet life in the hills. The man who had walked away from both worlds now found himself a bridge between them. He had taken Mara's list, the one with the names, and he had taken the maps. He now led the official search parties, the ones funded by the territorial government. South, he moved through the brothels of New Orleans, the work camps of the bayou, a quiet, unmovable Kiowa man, his eyes seeing everything. His visits to Juniper Crossing were rare and always unannounced. He would simply appear at dusk. Sometimes he was alone. Sometimes he had women with him, pale, haunted women in borrowed clothes. But always he would walk to the porch, and before he would accept a cup of coffee, he would knock 3 sharp, clear raps on the support beam. It was his signal to Rowan and Mara inside. It meant, "I am home." And it meant, "The light has come." One night, in a driving November rain, the 3 knocks came. Rowan opened the door. Tehun was there, his duster soaked, and behind him, a wagon. In the back, huddled under a canvas, were 4 women. He brought them inside. They were thin, terrified, and one was crying. A constant, broken sound. Mara, her face calm, said nothing. She built up the fire. She made broth. She brought blankets. She did not ask them their names. She did not ask them their story. She just sat by the fire, and she waited. When the soup was gone, and the warmth had returned to their hands, Mara went to her small desk in the corner. She pulled out her copy of the list. "I am going to read," she said, her voice soft. "This is the roll. This is the book from that place." The women froze. Mara began to read the names. Sarah, Elspeth, Anna. The woman who had been crying. A young girl of no more than 20, her hair a pale, lank blonde, looked up. Her eyes were wide, red-rimmed. What did you say?" "Anna," Mara repeated, her voice gentle. The girl's hand flew to her mouth. That's me. I'm Anna. He never called me that. He called me Unit." She burst into tears, but this time The sound was different. It was not a sound of despair. It was a sound of breaking. He knew my name, she sobbed, and he wrote it down. Mara looked at her, her own eyes shining. Yes, she said, he wrote it down, and now you are home, and you can claim it. In the spring, Rowan built a new barn. The old one was too small. He said the one cow had become two. The old gray gelding had a new young mare for company. It was a good barn, with tight joints and a solid foundation, built on the spot where Tehan's wind chimes had rung. And over the door, he hung a sign. He had carved the letters himself, Mara teaching him the shapes. It was not fancy, but it was clear. It did not say Hale Ranch. It said Ashwater Haven, a place for those who, having crossed the desert, needed to rest. The house was no longer a fortress. It was a home. The bullet holes in the logs had been filled with new, clean mortar. The talking holes in the wall, Tehan's battlefield invention, were now used by Mara to call to Rowan in the other room. One evening, Rowan was standing at the stove, a canvas apron tied, somewhat awkwardly, around his waist. He was stirring a pot, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mara came up behind him, a small, wind-up music box in her hands. It had been her mother's, one of the few things she had managed to save from the wagon, found by Tehan a month after the trial. She wound it. A thin, tinny, but beautiful melody began to play. Rowan turned, looking at the apron, and then at her, a sheepish look on his face. Mara laughed. It was a sound that was still new in this house, a full, clear, unafraid sound. "You're a terrible cook, Rowan Hale," she said. "I'm learning," he grumbled. She smiled and set the music box on the table. She stepped closer to him, her hands coming to rest on his chest, on the rough canvas of the apron. "You are," she agreed. She leaned her head, her cheek against his shoulder, her eyes closing. He was warm. He was solid. He was real. Rowan's arms, dusted with flour, came around her waist. He held her, not in a desperate grip, not in passion, but in a simple, profound embrace of partnership. They stood in the middle of their kitchen, in the warm, yellow lamplight, and they swayed, just slightly, to the tinny music. It was not a dance. It was a prayer. It was a thanks, spoken not in words, but in the simple, shared breath of two people who had found their way home. The letter, when it came, was from New Orleans. It was from the territorial marshal Tehan worked with. Rowan read it aloud by the lamp. "The federal court has convened." It said, "3 gentlemen, whose names you will know, have been indicted. The Bayou St. Martha exchange has been burned. The network, it is broken." Rowan paused and read the last line. "Wyatt remains at large. He is a ghost, and the reward is unclaimed. But it does not matter. The men who once paid him are now afraid. Fear, it seems, has changed sides." Rowan folded the letter. Mara, who was darning one of his socks, looked up. "He's still out there." "Yes," Rowan said. He put the letter in the fire. "But he is running. We are not." The school grew. The next Saturday, there were 8 children. They sat on the porch, their bare feet dangling, listening as Rowan finished mending a bridle. One of the Gable boys, the oldest, pointed to the Ashwater Haven sign. "Mr. Hale, why? Why did you come here?" Rowan stopped his work. I was looking for a quiet place, son. But my PA says, he says you're a hero. He says you went into a barn to buy a horse. And you pulled Miss Mara out of the wall." Rowan looked at Mara, who was standing in the doorway, smiling. He looked back at the boy. "That's more or less the truth of it." The boy's eyes were wide. Weren't you scared of Crowder?" He paused, then whispered, Do you regret it fighting me?" Rowan Hale looked at his hands, the scarred, calloused hands of a rancher, a fighter, a man who was learning to build. He thought of the barn, the chain, the manacle. He thought of the 2 years of his life he had lost, looking away. He looked up at the boy, and a slow, rare smile touched his lips. "Son," he said, "if I could go back and do it again, I'd have hit him sooner." The sun was setting. It was a brilliant, bloody, beautiful sunset, the kind that only the high plains could offer. The light spilled over the porch of Ashwater Haven. Mara was leaning against the porch rail, and Rowan stood beside her, his arm around her, her head resting on his shoulder. Their hands, his large, hers small, found each other. They clasped. A simple, profound, unbreakable bond. The land was still harsh. It promised no softness. It promised wind and drought and sudden, terrible storms. But it offered no lies. It offered a solid ground to stand on. And it offered, always, a chance to make things right. They had taken it. Together. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know what you think in the comments. Tell us where you are listening from, and join the conversation. Please subscribe to the Wild West Stories 1850 channel, like this video, and give us a little extra support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by more people.